We're in week 4 of the Elestrals Championship League now, and I am going up against Jonny piloting Mono Water. So this is my, I think, 4th time recording this, probably arguably 5th time. I've a lot of stop and go because I have a lot to say about this matchup. I've done some prep and I have a lot of opinions and strategies for him that I would love to just discuss, but every time I sit down to record it, it just feels like a rambling mess. So to organize it, I first want to highlight what I think Jonny could bring. I think the most obvious one, and the one that I think he would feel the most comfortable with, is just his defensive water beaters deck with the Trident lock. To my knowledge, that's what he's been bringing every single week. I didn't really check out week 1 because I was very sick at that time. So I just didn't check it out, honestly. I probably should go back and watch that. But from what I have seen, that has been his favorite kind of deck to pilot. And I know he's piloted even before the ECL, just out with some stuff from other elements. So I definitely think that's the one he is most comfortable with. And I could see that being the one that he would be most likely to bring. But I also don't think that's the best variant of water that he could bring, and he might recognize that and try to change it up on me. I think the best variant would actually be a Majesty variant, and you might think, Majesty really isn't that great against my deck. I've got Resting on Your Laurels for it, I can time a PTA to take it out, and even if he does set up the Trident lock, I have so much rune removal that I can disrupt that pretty easily. But my deck has the second slowest offense just behind water, meaning Jonny has more time against my deck to set up Majesty plus Trident lock, and if he's careful, he can actually play around Resting on Your Laurels. If you can get an Elestral to stick, and then just go Tadpuff with Poseidon straight into Majesty, Resting on Your Laurels cannot target that Majesty. It has to target the other one, and then I'm spending a turn trying to attack over that Elestral, hoping he just doesn't play another one, and that's going to be a hard kind of counter the Resting on Your Laurels to get out of, because the priority does pass over to him to be able to play out an Elestral. So I definitely think that deck has the time to set up against me and the means to. It's not going to be infallible, but it does require me to have more answers to actually answer it. And in a similar vein, I could also see Jonny running maybe his defensive water beaters deck with Capricorn at the top end. It's a pretty good beater as well, so he's not solely relying on Galaxy, and because it casts stuff from the underworld, it can play around Resting on Your Laurels innately, and it also, if he sets up the Trident lock, can't be hit by shield. If he has another Elestral out on board, he can set it up so it can't get poison tip arrowed. There are just options that he can run with Capricorn to help it stick despite not having rune disruption of his own. I could also see him doing it because it would be funny, since, Jonny beating me with Capricorn, one of my favorite Elestrals, that would be a insult to injury for me, so I wouldn't put it past him, not any malice, of course, just for fun, because honestly, this deck, as you can see, I run 3 Exaltair, so I'm trying to beat him with his own bird, so yeah, I could see him trying to do the same to me. Both those out of the way, I focus my deck around what I think is the best way to beat Jonny regardless of what variant he brings, because really that variant just kind of changes up what the top end of the deck is. At its core, it's still a very slow defensive deck to begin with, and I'm taking advantage of that aspect of it, as well as the fact Jonny cannot actually pop runes. He can just lock them down with the Trident. This is actually the 3rd iteration of the deck. Originally, I was thinking of just going Penterror, and whenever he throws out the Galaxy, just blind into Hydrake and try to get out the Penterror to steal a win that way. But then I realized Jonny has a really clean out to Penterror in just Tsunami or Altar plus Veritaqua, which I don't think will be the most difficult thing. And I think that's actually a reason for him to maybe bring water beaters a bit more, is just fear of Penterror, as that deck would probably be able to very easily answer Penterror. Thus, I decided not to bring it. The second variant of the deck took advantage of the fact that Jonny has the most counter runes out of any of us, or elements, in that he can run Tsunami with it. And so I thought I would try a Falcane variant, pretty much just stick the Falcane, nuke the back row, and go from there. But Falcane gets very expensive, and actually it doesn't out Poison Tip Arrow, it doesn't out Tsunami. Jonny can technically Gorgon's Gaze. So the only thing I was really dealing with is Shield of Achilles. And then once I do the initial board wipe, if Jonny plays down another counter rune, do I want to spend the 1 or 2 spirits just to pop that as well? Not really. So if he draws an out, it's like I'm forced to either just accept that he has the out and hope that the tempo is enough and lose the Falcane, or just pop it. So I didn't really like it. But instead, what I did notice when I was testing that deck is how the stall in the early game, I can just kind of take advantage of that, mainly with Exaltair and P-Gust. So since Jonny probably won't be going on the offense too much, like he might be setting up defensive Foamies or Mustachians, Sluggles, maybe he might try to throw out some Veritaquas, P-Gust and Exaltair actually don't care if Jonny tries to stall out. P-Gust can take care of his back row. Granted, it's not burning him of spirits, but since P-Gust just needs to receive a wind spirit, it's not like I'm using spirits on it, so that's pretty good. And then Exaltair, if I can get the P-Gust to stick, Exaltair can come out and start nexusing spirits to P-Gust to further pop stuff and burn Jonny going over his defensive wall. So I don't necessarily need to be able to attack with these two. So like against a Foamy, I don't really want to give him the value by attacking over a Foamy. So why not instead just kind of go over the top? Just let him sit on that Foamy. I can just pop stuff and burn him. And thus that kind of shaped the main early game strategy for this deck. Just tried to set up P-Gust plus Exaltair to nuke his back row and start burning him. And then the final piece of the puzzle is Chrysor here, because I don't think I can safely sit on P-Gust plus Exaltair the entire game. At some point, Jonny's going to move to go on the offense, and while definitely I can hold on to counter runes because, well, he can't pop them, and I don't necessarily need to always answer stuff in the early game. I can just let him sit on some of his defensive stuff, so I will have these. I still want another way to just kind of push more as he starts answering it, because I do think there won't be times where I can always just sit on these two. So thus, I think Chrysor is great for that. It's sustained since it recovers me too, and again, it doesn't care about that defensive line. It can just attack straight over towards the Spirit deck. And the more I looked into Chrysor, the more I realized this is probably the hardest Elestral for Jonny to actually out. Again, he can't stall against it because I can attack directly, and I can still choose to hit over stuff with that 8 attack if need be, and especially if I've already cleared the back row with P-Gust, Chrysor can just attack freely. In terms of Jonny being able to attack over the Chrysor, that's a tall ask, because at least if he goes the beater route, his deck is very reliant on the whole swapping mechanic, either through Molstation or Galaxy, and because of that, simple attack buffs, such as Trident of Poseidon, don't actually increase the attack. Because that attack buff is applied first and then the swap, it becomes a defensive buff. Meaning that Molstation and Galaxy with a Trident is pretty much hard capped at their defensive stat. Ways he can out it though is Molstation with 2 spirits plus a Atlantis, because that gets Molstation to 8 attacks and increases both the attack and defense. And the other option would be an Oistress with a Galaxy with a Poseidon with 3 spirits on it, as that would get Oistress also to 8 defense, which would swap to 8 attack. So that, in those scenarios, do crash the Chrysor, which isn't great for Jonny either, because he still has to take a damage and I still get to recover too, but at least gets rid of the Chrysor. It's also a lot of spirits to throw on board for me to maybe just be able to snipe the 3-spirit Poseidon with a P-Gust as well. So they're outs, but I don't think they're really the cleanest outs either. And as for resting on your laurels, I can actually, since I'm just attacking over his defensive walls, if I just say in a simplified scenario, he just has a Foamy out and I attack over the Chrysor, and I have no other spirits out, he can't use resting on your laurels on it because it's only a 1-spirit differential, not a 2-spirit. And then for every additional spirit he has on board, that allows me to put an additional spirit on board. And honestly, once I get a 1-spirit out, he can't hit it anyway without doing it the 1-spirit first. So that is really, really obnoxious. And sometimes I will have extra spirits out on board, but most of the time it'll probably be like Aeolus, and I can just use its search effect to get it off the board to make sure Chrysor is safe. So that's the strategy. Getting into the card by card, I run the 3 Chrysor because of course this is my main top end. I do always want to see it, so I max it out because that's an integral part of my strategy. For the 1 spirits, I run 3 Aramare, 3 Exaltair, 3 P-Gust, and 3 Sorlet. Of course, Exaltair, P-Gust maxed out because they're the main part of my strategy, at least in the early game, so I do want to find these. And then, of course, I can't just run 6 1-spirit Elestrals. I need to find more. So I round it out with Aramare, which is just a good body. I just need to be careful against Veritaqua if I throw it in defense, because Veritaqua can very easily out it. But it's also a bit awkward if it's only at 4 attack, because then he can just throw it on a Galaxy and attack over it anyway. But I do also have counter runes to help with that. And Sorlet is just the ultimate way to deal with Jonny's walls through attacks, just be able to swap them from defense to attack to easily be able to attack over it. Molstation cannot stop Sorlet, which is also great. So that's just another option if maybe I don't have my P-Gust Exaltair online, but I still want to do something more proactive. Sorlet is a little expensive having to expend one, but hey, if I'm forcing Jonny to use spirits just to preserve his Elestrals, that's not too bad either. For the wind runes, I run 2 Bag of Winds, 3 Aeolus, and 3 Island. Aeolus is here, of course, to find my pieces. I'm only running 12, and I want to see specifically P-Gust and Exaltair, so I definitely want to max this one out. And the nice thing is, Jonny doesn't have any rune destruction, so unless I physically don't have the spirits to do so, I can just load Aeolus up with all 4 spirits and make sure I just have them. 1, to be able to search out stuff, 2, also to use as a Nexus Bank for Exaltair to move spirits around. Just super versatile and really kind of the enabler of this entire strategy that I have here at the lower end. If I find multiple Aeolus, oh, even better, just means I can more consistently replenish if Jonny can answer P-Gust or Exaltair. I also run 2 Bag of Winds just as an extra Nexus Bank for the Exaltair throw spirits on the P-Gust. That way I'm not limited to only getting 1 search off the Aeolus and holding it for Nexus stuff. I have another way to do that. And also, like, sometimes sometimes maybe the Can't Be Tarred by Rune effect might come in handy. I don't expect it to, but you never know when those situations pop up. I just need to protect something from a resting on your laurels. And I think in testing, I did set up one where I had the Exaltair with more spirits. No, I had the P-Gust with more spirits, and then equipped a Bag of Winds onto the Exaltair. That way, the lowest spirit Elestral cannot be targeted, and therefore resting on your laurels was completely useless. And I think also, if Jonny tries to attack into something with a Bag of Winds and have a Gorgon's Gaze, if the Galaxy buff is applying there, and I can flip it back by negating Galaxy's effect, causing the Elestral equipped with Bag of Winds to destroy. If I have an AS on board, that's also another Rune Pop. So that one's a very far out scenario, but also a really funny one if I get it off. And finally, 3 islands. I almost ran it at 2, but honestly, I didn't have enough cards to fill up the deck space, and I thought island was fine. It's another Nexus Bank for Exaltair. Jonny's running Atlantis, one of his best ways to actually buff his Elestrals. This acts as also a destruction for his Stadium Rune. So all in all, I do think this card's super versatile. And the extra stat buff can also help me go on the offense with attacks as well and be able to hit relevant numbers, especially if I'm just throwing spirits onto P-Gust and Exaltair. It can make them big and more easily be able to attack over Jonny stuff. For the counter runes, I run 3 Gorgon's Gaze, 3 Poison Tip Arrow, and 2 Shield of Achilles. So only 8 counter runes, and that's because Jonny's deck is slower and a bit less offensive, so I think I can get away with fewer counter runes and round out my deck in other areas. Gorgon's Gaze, I think, is actually the best here, being able to chain in response to a Trident being cast. That way, Jonny can't do anything proactive, and I get a chance to address the Trident lock before Jonny gets to do anything proactive. It can also shut down Tadpuff into something shenanigans and other Ascension stuff if I time it beforehand, and also has other utilities such as maybe stopping an Aphros or something, or a Foamy if Jonny's trying to crash a Foamy. So super versatile against Jonny's deck, which relies heavily on the abilities of all the water cards. Gorgon's Gaze is great for that, and since I don't necessarily care about answering them all the time, a lot of times just Gorgon's Gazing, shutting them down for a turn is enough, even if I don't attack over it, to be able to facilitate the rest of my strategy. And other times I can still just attack over it if I've maybe popped their entire back row of P-Gust. I just need to slow the Elestrals down a bit. Poison Tip Arrow similarly kind of gets around the Trident lock, being able to chain it to an Elestral enchant, though of course if Jonny sets up the Trident lock and then casts an Elestral, that's a bit of another story, but I still think it's good enough for that reason. If he tries to go Aphros, chain it to prevent the draw, and maybe if he doesn't have an Elestral on board and tries to go Majesty, this card's going to be great for that. So it's a great way to keep Jonny off of his pieces without having to attack necessarily, while also making it a bit hard for him to attack over my stuff. And finally, 2 shield. I do think it's important to have these just in case if it's just a Galaxy attacking, just being able to get rid of it can be super crucial, or maybe just delay it by a turn. So I still think it's totally worthwhile, but I'm definitely going to try to use these over my Gorgon's Gaze and Poison Tip Arrows to save these for the Trident lock, because of course once Trident lock goes up, shield is pretty much useless. But so it's not as good in this matchup, thus I think 2 copies is perfectly fine, but I still think it is super crucial since it's still going to be live most of the game to at least run 2 copies. And rounding out the deck list, for the Invoke runes, the generic Invoke runes at least, I run 3 Ambrosia, 2 Drops of Leth, 2 Nectar of the Gods, and 2 Resting on Your Laurels. Ambrosia is here because this deck is expensive with Aeolus, expend with Sorlet. I'm trying to ascend into Crypts. Oh, Crypts kind of refunds itself, so that one's not as expensive as it may seem. And of course the counter runes as well. I just need that extra recovery, so I maxed out on Ambrosia because also this matchup is a bit slower. I think this card is a dead card a lot more of the time than it otherwise would be, and just being able to sustain on spirits to be able to still afford counter runes or other plays Aeoluses is going to be super important. I mean, this is just a net back too, so I think at 3 copies it is totally worth it. For my draw, I run 2 Nectar of the Gods and 2 Drops of Leth. Baron put out a very good video talking about Nectar of the Gods, and I feel like it might be a good idea to make a video at some point discussing why I really like the 2-2 split of these two, because that's really what I've been running in a lot of my decks, and why do I run it? Now, is it great for all decks? Absolutely not. For this deck, though, I do think it's great. I do need that extra draw power because this deck does not inherently draw a lot. It's got Search with Aeolus for Elestrals, but I still want to be able to find counter runes and my other runes, like pretty much everything else here, and Nectar of the Gods is great for that. But honestly, by the time I get to the 3, I'd rather just have a card I can actually play. So therefore, I think 2 is fine, just to be able to hopefully find it in the early game or mid game when the draw is fine. And if I find it in the late game, well, that sucks. I still think it's worthwhile enough, and it doesn't come up enough in the late game to make it worthwhile running it too. And Drops of Leth is just a great way to refresh the hand. I can definitely have bricks in this deck since this deck is very piece reliant with multiple Chrysor, multiple Bag of Winds Island, and just be able to refresh those, but shuffle back in those pieces to draw into cards that potentially are very useful, I think is super crucial for this deck. Even though it does cost 2 spirits, just finding a way to actually answer the board and progress the game state, a lot of times I found it to be worth those 2 spirits. So I think 2 is perfectly fine, and a lot of times if I find multiple, I'm shuffling back in with drops because a lot of times I'm holding this. So I arguably could drop this down to 1, but a lot of times I still want to see at least 1. And if I see 2, a lot of times I'm just holding it long enough where I just shuffle it back in anyway, and it's a-okay. So I really love this card. It's definitely, I think in previous weeks, given me some great outs, just kind of like, oh, this hand, most of this stuff is not very useful, shuffle it back, and oh look, an AOS, I can find my answer. Simple as that. And finally, 2 Resting on Your Laurels. This card, only 2 copies because at some point in the game, I do want to try to get ahead, and at that point, Resting on Your Laurels is a dead card. But in the early game, when it's still a bit back and forth, this is great just to kind of keep Jonny off of foamies. If I mean, sometimes I'm ignoring them. Sometimes maybe I haven't found these pieces and I'm trying to use Swirlet and Aeromare. Resting on Our Laurels will be great for that. Jonny set up like a ton of spirits on Afros. It can out that. And I think most importantly, if he is actually on the Majesty and he doesn't try to keep an Elestral on board to block it, or I can maneuver it in such a way where he can't, Resting on Your Laurels is probably the best way to answer it. So just having an Elestral pop, even if it is conditional, I still think is super important. And with the slower decks that we're probably going to be using this time around, especially if Jonny is able to answer my Elestrals on board, this can be a great card to get caught up. So I think 2 copies is a-okay for that and comes up enough to be able to answer the stuff it needs to, but also not clogging the hand. For the side deck, honestly, there wasn't too much I wanted to run. If Jonny's on Majesty, I'm siding in the 1 additional Resting on Your Laurels, getting rid of an Island of Aeolia. That way I can up my chance of finding the outs, such as Poison Tip Arrow and Resting on Your Laurels. So even if Jonny attempts to start playing around them, maybe like a double Resting on Your Laurels can out the board, maybe a PTA plus Resting on Your Laurels outs it. And it also kind of gives me a bit more flexibility if I find multiples of these to then answer the lower pieces, such as maybe just be able to PTA a foamy he threw out. That way, maybe he's more forced to go into the Majesty by itself. It just gives me way more flexibility in that matchup, and that's an easy side in. Everything else is just kind of like, I don't expect to use it, but it's there in case I do. 3rd shield if he isn't running the Trident lock, and I don't know, since his deck probably won't be very aggressive, this will be necessary, but theoretically if he's like running Capricorn without the Trident lock, yeah, I want to throw in the 3rd shield for that one. Rise from the Ashes if I feel like I need an extra oomph card for the end game, but at the same time I can brick on that early, and this deck is very tight on spirit usage, and I kind of just expect to maybe get an Exalter P-Gust and then into a Christ or Establish. Most of the time I'm going to be fine anyway, so it's just if maybe I feel like my deck needs that extra oomph again. I don't think it will, but it's there for that. And then 3 Tornado, since he is most likely going to run the Trident lock, if I feel like I need another out to it, or just another way to out, maybe like an Atlantis, or maybe just the Rogue counter rune that he set face down, I guess this is fine. I just don't expect to be in many scenarios where Tornado just bounce a rune back to hand will be the difference between winning or not. It just delays it by a turn, uses up a spirit, a card in hand. I think this card is very low value, and this deck really isn't trying to like just steal a game all of a sudden. I think that's where this card will really matter, but it's not. It's more of a slow burn kind of deck. So Tornado, if I really feel like I need it. And then finally just ran out with Pantera, just in case Jonny brings something really weird, or the way he's playing, I kind of feel like I just need to kind of YOLO Hydrate Twindra into Pantera. It's an out, or if he isn't running Veritaqua, something else. It's just another option. Again, I just don't expect it to really be relevant. What, if he throws out the Galaxy, I could do it. If he throws out a Capricorn or even a Majesty, that's so expensive to deal with if I'm crashing Hydrate Twindra into Pantera. So I don't love it, hence why I'm honestly not running optimal ratios like I would prefer. I could see 2 Twindra being fine. Usually I prefer 3 and a second Pantera, but alas, I don't expect to go into it, so that's what I'm running for this deck. I am super excited for this matchup because I feel like I've prepared very well. I've got a very solid strategy, and I just cannot wait and I hope that I can execute it very well and it works as I planned. And honestly, it will just be hilarious if I beat Jonny with his own bird, because, well, yeah, he's always complaining about how it got nerfed down to 3 attack and isn't as good now. So then just to be like, hey, look, Jonny, it's still good. It's just going to be a fun thing to do. And I don't know if he will appreciate that or not. We'll see what happens. As always, the match will be going up at 10 a.m. EST on my channel tomorrow, so Saturday. So you can check it out there. Subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you're notified when I do upload that, as well as any other content. And I don't know when Jonny's going to be uploading his gameplay. I know he's a little strapped for time, but his will definitely be up as well as Wirtz and Baron, who are also playing this week, will most likely have their content up at the same time as well. So you can check out all their channels down in the description below, as well as LUCK's channel. He's not playing this week, but he will be playing next week. So just check them all out. But before signing off, I want to hear from you all. What do you think of my deck and strategy? Do you like it? Is there anything that you would do differently if you were playing into a mono water matchup? But with that being said though, look for the match coming out tomorrow, as well as any other content coming out real soon.